Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Monday Bagel. I'm your host Michał Jackowski, and today we have an incredibly special guest joining us, Anil Ananthaswamy. Anil is an award-winning science journalist and author who's been writing extensively on AI and technology. His latest book, Why Machines Learn, dives deep into the fascinating world of machine learning and explores the very essence of how machines acquire intelligence or not. We'll talk about it. Today, we'll explore Anil's journey into the world of AI, key insights from his book, and his broader thoughts on the future of machine learning. Anil, welcome to the show, and it's great you could join me.
Michal, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Let's kick things off by talking about your latest book. What inspired you to explore the topic of machine learning in Why Machines Learn, and what do you hope readers will gain from it?
Maybe I can give a little bit of background about myself to motivate, the reasons why I wrote Why Machines Learn. I used to be a software engineer about 2 decades ago. My bachelor's was in electronics and electrical engineering. My master's was also in, electronics and computer engineering. I worked as a software engineer building large-scale distributed systems for a while. And then at some point, I decided I wanted to be a writer, and I switched to writing about science. I really wanted to pay attention to the broader things that are happening in society with regards to science. And in science journalism and science writing, I found something that I was really passionate about. Because I had come from technology, I didn't want to write about technology. I felt like I wanted to do other things. So for a long time, I wrote about physics, about biology, climate change. So, my first three books were the first one was on cosmology and astroparticle physics. The second one was on the neuroscience of the human sense of self. The third one was on quantum mechanics. And so, anytime I wrote about these subjects, when I would interview the researchers and the scientists, it was always from the perspective of wanting to understand what they're doing. I never felt like I could do those things. Like when I would hear particle physicists talking about their work, I had no illusions about being able to do any of that. It was just, interesting to learn and write about it. But then about maybe around 2016, 2017, I found myself writing more and more about machine learning because that was becoming a big deal. And the weird thing was that when I started interviewing scientists about their machine learning research, the software engineer part of me really got intrigued because here was something that I could do if I wanted to. So in 2019, I got a fellowship at MIT. They have a lovely program called the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship, where you get a year to be at MIT and take any course you want at MIT and Harvard. And I decided to retrain myself to understand the underlying sort of concepts in machine learning and deep learning. So the first thing I did was teach myself PyTorch and Python because I hadn't coded for 20 years. So I really went back to sort of school. I sat with teenagers in a big MIT class with 300 students learning Python and PyTorch and started coding a little bit. Got very interested in sort of building little things with deep learning. And then that fascination then led to wanting to understand more about the underlying mathematics of machine learning. And it was when I was learning about the mathematics that the writer part of me kicked in again, because I felt like, oh, this is so beautiful. There are so many stories here to be told. And I suddenly wanted to write a book that was not just about the normal things that you see in popular science in magazines about machine learning and AI. Even if they go into depth, they avoid the mathematics. It's not considered something that you want to do for listener or the lay reader. I wanted to actually bring the mathematics, the story of the mathematics, along with the equations to an audience. So that's how the sort of inspiration began. It purely came out of wanting to learn machine learning for myself, and then realizing that there was something very beautiful here to be talked about.
That's extremely interesting because as a lawyer working with technology, I often struggle how to talk to other lawyers for example, judges about technology and AI in a simple way. As a
Mm.
science journalist, you're often tasked with translating complex topics like machine learning or mathematics, you mentioned, into something accessible for general public. How do you approach it, making AI engaging and understandable?
I think there are many levels at which you can approach explaining something. It really depends on who your audience is. And there's a wonderful line from a piece that the science editor at The Guardian, it was basically advice to writers about science. And one of the things he said was, don't underestimate your readers' intelligence, and don't overestimate how much background knowledge they have. So basically, make sure that you provide, when you're explaining, enough background knowledge to understand what you're writing about, but also don't underestimate their intelligence to follow complex topics. As a journalist, my instinct is also to think about storytelling. So one of the first things that I would do if I'm writing a book, or if even I'm giving a talk, is to think in terms of stories. I think there is something very fundamental about the human storytelling ability, both to tell stories and to absorb stories. So when we are given information in the form of stories, we tend to absorb it better for whatever reason. There might be a cognitive bias in us. We ourselves are, we tell stories about ourselves to ourselves. This is something that is very evident from the study of the neuroscience of the sense of self, that even our own self is a kind of story that we tell ourselves. So there is some cognitive apparatus in us that grasps stories. And so, from a writer's perspective, that's a great tool. Like, if you can think of complex topics in the framework of stories, then that's a big battle that you've already won. And so, for me, making AI and machine learning interesting was first to go looking for, key stories that underpinned the development of machine learning. And once I did that, that gave me a framework for the larger story. So each chapter in the book is an individual, it's kind of a story about one particular development and the characters involved in it. And then you use that to mm, also bring in the mathematics. There is another aspect, like when you're writing about mathematics, it can seem dry and boring to people, or even sometimes intimidating. And so you have to work a little bit at making it less boring. I personally don't find it boring at all, and I suspect that most people who will pick up my book are also going to be inclined to, I hope, inclined to want to learn the mathematics. But there is so much beauty in the mathematics and elegance in these theorems and proofs that kind of are behind machine learning. If you can convey that excitement, again, that's another big battle won. So it's a lot of it is about organizing your content in the form of stories and getting across the excitement that you feel as a writer, bring it onto the page.
Give me the best example from your book to attract lawyers or to enable them answer the question maybe why machines learn, because it's the main topic of the book, the cover question.
The title of the book, Why Machines Learn, was itself very deliberately chosen. I didn't say how machines learn. A lot of people have asked me, why not how? And my sort of glib answer to this is, how, in my mind, represents, because I came from software engineering, how is the algorithm? Here are the steps that a machine takes to learn to do what it does. But when you analyze the algorithm and ask yourself, why does this algorithm work, right? Sometimes you can, as a software engineer, just write something without really understanding the underlying math that makes the algorithm tick. So the why is really the mathematical rationale for, why the machine learns anything. So, I'll give you an example of the theorem and proof that made me want to write this book in the first place. And I was listening to a lecture by a professor in Cornell, Kilian Weinberger. And if your audience hasn't heard of him, I strongly recommend people go to YouTube. I think he gave these set of lectures in 2018 to his class, machine learning class at Cornell. It's one of the best. He's such a wonderful teacher, and just so full of energy and humor. And it was when I was listening to him explain the very first machine learning sort of neural network algorithm that was devised in the late 1950s by a Cornell psychologist named Frank Rosenblatt. And Rosenblatt basically designed what today can be called the first artificial neuron that learns, and and he was able to make the machine um, basically discern patterns in data. So, given, let's say, two digits of the alphabet, it could tell one from the other, right? It could recognize, so to say, digits or letters. Now, it was a single layer neural network. This was very early days and he knew how to train it. He wrote the algorithm for it. He showed it working. It required enormous amounts of computation for 1950s. He had built it in hardware. He was using a IBM mainframe. It was a giant thing. But the amazing thing was when people, as soon as he published the algorithm, people started analyzing it mathematically. And it's the beauty of the proofs that followed, which showed that if there exists data that, in this case, what the algorithm was trying to do, what the machine was trying to do, was find a dividing line. So imagine a two-dimensional data set, just x-axis, y-axis. There are a cluster of points in one place and another cluster of points in another place. And as long as you can draw a straight line between the two clusters of data, so let's say one cluster represents, I don't know, images of cats, and another cluster represents images of dogs, and you're trying to find a straight line that divides the two clusters. And as long as a straight line exists, Rosenblatt's algorithm, Rosenblatt's artificial neuron, could find that straight line, or could find a straight line. And there's a very, very simple proof that just uses linear algebra, vectors, and matrices to prove that if such a straight line exists between the two clusters of data, meaning that you can actually separate the cats from the dogs, then his algorithm will find that separating line in finite time. You have to think back, this was 1959. Here was a simple two-page proof using nothing but high school vector algebra that showed that if such a division exists between two clusters of data, his algorithm will find it in finite time. It was like it bound the algorithm, saying this will work definitely. It was an amazing thing. And when I was looking at that proof, that's what made me want to write that book. I felt like this is so amazing. And then as you start delving deeper and deeper into the mathematics, the whole field is sprinkled with such simple ideas that then have built upon each other, right? We can talk about Gen AI and how all this eventually leads to things like what we should be concerned about now. But the roots are long back in 1959.
So this was my next question. Where are we going right now? How does it look right now? And how does the future look like? How will Gen AI evolve? What's your idea?
In order to answer that question, we probably need to take a little kind of narrative arc from what I just talked about, which was very, very simple pattern recognition, right? There is some pattern in the data, and your algorithm is capable of learning about that pattern, and it essentially builds an internal model of that pattern, right? In this case, with Rosenblatt's algorithm, it was simply finding a straight line to divide two clusters of data in two dimensions, or find a plane to divide clusters of data in three dimensions, or find a hyperplane if it's higher dimensional data. This data can be as complex as you want. So you can basically represent your data in 100 dimensions. It won't be possible for us to visualize it. But if, for instance, you're trying to say, I need to build a machine that recognizes a pattern that separates this 100-dimensional cluster of data from this 100-dimensional cluster of data, it will do it. But that at this stage is just something called discriminative AI. It's just being able to discriminate between two types of data, so that next time when you encounter new data and you ask the machine learning algorithm, so is this a cat or is this a dog? It will be able to tell you. by simply mapping it onto its high dimensional space and seeing which side of the line that it falls on. And if it falls on the cat side, it'll say it's a cat. And it doesn't really understand anything beyond that. It's just doing pattern recognition. But this has already taken us very far. Discriminative AI already, like when you think of all the stuff that is happening in recognizing medical imaging, very, very sophisticated analysis of medical images in order to spot signs of cancer before a clinician might be able to see it, or spotting the signs of progression of Alzheimer's, again, before a clinician might be able to do it, those kinds of things, using very sophisticated image recognition techniques. All of that goes back to very simple pattern recognition that I just mentioned. But at some point, people started realizing that uh, you could actually not just learn to discriminate between different classes of data, but you can actually learn about the statistical structure of the data itself.
Mhm.
So what you learn, let's say, again, I'm just going to talk about the two-dimensional case where you have a cluster of points. Let's say on this surface, there's a cluster of points on the left side that represents cats, and there's a cluster of points on the right side that represent dogs. And you can either figure out what separates the two, or you can figure out the statistical structure of that data. And by statistical structure, I'm talking about the probability distribution over the data. So you essentially learn that, oh, over the cluster of data representing cats, the probability distribution peaks, and then it falls again, and then it peaks again where the dogs are.
Mhm.
So you get some three-dimensional surface over the data, right? Once you have found that three-dimensional data over that surface, then if you're capable of sampling from that surface, you're most likely to sample from the peak about the cats or the peak about the dogs. And then that peak that you sample, if you just project it downwards, it will give you some data that it relates to. So you basically sample from that distribution, figure out what that underlying data is, and then spit it out. And when you spit it out, you're either going to get a cat or a dog. It won't necessarily look like the cats or the dogs that were in your training data, but you will end up producing something that looks very similar to the data you had. And we've just talked, what I've just given you is an example of a very simple generative AI.
Is it knowledge or it's just a statistical probability? One of my guests this summer said that the whole generative AI is a hallucination with some cases where it's accurate by accident. So is it knowledge? These machines learn or they find a better statistical probability in this case?
It's a very good question, and he's right. So what the machine has learned is the statistical regularity that exists in the data, right? And you can use that, what it has learned, either to do discriminative AI to recognize things, or but recognition only in terms of the patterns, right? It recognizes that a pattern is like another pattern that it had seen before, and because we told it previously that the previous pattern that it was trained on was cats or dogs, it just labels the new pattern a cat or a dog. Does it know anything about what it means to be a cat or a dog? No. At this stage, no, right? Same thing with generative AI. When you learn the probability distribution over the data, uh, it has just learned that there are two types of data, and that one type is more likely and the second type is more likely, and every other type in the distribution is not likely. When it samples, it's going to give you one type or the other type. Does it know that one type or the other type is a dog or cat? No. Because knowledge or semantics is a completely different thing. And right now, I would sort of agree with what the professor is saying, that this is what these machines are doing. But remember, this is really already very powerful, right? If you take 100,000 images of cats and 100,000 images of dogs, high resolution images, right? I just demonstrated this in 2 dimensions and building a 3-dimensional probability
Mhm.
distribution over that. You can have a million dimensional data, right? Very, very high resolution images, and build this distribution on top of that. And when you sample, you get another million pixels worth of data for image, and you get very high quality images of a cat. Um, does it have any use? Absolutely. For instance, especially in medical imaging, right? Gen AI is a big deal
Mhm.
because medical imaging, one of the things in trying to train machine learning systems is they lack data. So you can use Gen AI to generate high quality synthetic data to then further
Mhm.
train your systems, right? So you have to think about, what are the use cases that you can put these systems to, and those use cases may not need understanding cancer or understanding what a dog is or a cat is. Working with the statistical nature of data might be enough, right? But it's very, very true that uh, making sense of what this data is another layer of learning and understanding. And there is a long debate going on right now about that, especially when it comes to large language models, right? That's also a case of generative AI. Instead of images of dogs or cats, the probability distribution that the uh, large language model is learning is over words. So the
Mhm.
entire human written language, the corpus of human written language. So it has learned this very, very complex distribution. And then when you give it 100 words, it basically samples from that distribution conditioned upon the input that you gave it. So given 100 words and a vocabulary of 50,000 words, it literally calculates, you know, in a way of thinking, we don't quite know exactly what's happening inside them, but in a way of thinking, what it's doing is, given 100 words as input, it calculates a probability distribution over its vocabulary for those 100 words, samples from that distribution saying what is the next most likely word to follow, and it puts that next to the 100 words, has 101 words now, and it keeps doing that, and it produces something. So you can see that all it's doing is sampling from this probability distribution and putting it out. But despite that, we are getting some extraordinary behavior from these large language models. But it's very important to keep in mind that they are probabilistic machines. And yes, in a manner of speaking, they're always hallucinating. This idea that hallucination only refers to when they produce sort of wrong information is actually not right, not the right way to think about it. The process where it generates factually correct information versus factually wrong information is the same. It's always sampling from that distribution. So uh, when it generates the word red or the color green or something, does it really know what green and red mean? No, not at this point. But can it reason about red and green in certain contexts as to what that might mean? Like, you can ask it what will happen if a car was driving at an intersection and the traffic light turned red. It will give you an answer saying the car should stop. Now, you can argue endlessly, and being in the legal community, I'm sure this is one of those issues where you can easily make the case that it understands up to a certain level of semantic knowledge. So, depending on where you put the bar of what you mean by understanding, the large language model will either clear it happily, easily, or it will fail miserably. So, it really depends on where, as humans, we are putting our bar of what it means to understand. There are things that, as humans, we say to each other where our understanding is not very deep. We are almost operating at the level of large language models. But then there are other times when, as humans, we operate with a semantic grasp that is much, much deeper than a large language model will have. So again, it depends on the use case, depends on the
Mhm.
application, and I think I leave that to the legal community to fight over.
Maybe one last question about legal aspects or concerning legal discussions. We've been discussing for the last 2 years whether AI replaces lawyers or supports us, and most of my guests say that it will not replace human because of these things you mentioned as well, about hallucination, about probability, and other more complex issues. What's your vision? How do you envision humans and AI systems collaborating to solve complex problems in the future? Replacing, supporting, replacing in some parts?
I think it's the last thing. I think there will be a set of abilities that humans do right now. Doesn't matter what profession you take. I can take something like the field I am in, journalism, or also I'm familiar with another industry which is software, and or if you take the legal profession, I'm sure that there is a layer of work that will get replaced. So let me take something like software engineering, right? Um, right now, if you just use these large language model based code assistants, right, like Copilot, or it's kind of staggering how good they are in terms of being able to generate the first cut of code, right? I'll give you a very simple example. In for my book, almost every illustrative figure in the book, there's about 200 of them that I wrote the code for, and wrote the algorithms, made sure that the algorithm was working, and then generated all the illustrations to depict geometrically what is happening in these machine learning algorithms and models. And it took me a long time. I mean, this book was a 4-year long effort, and a lot of that was involved in learning how to code and all of that stuff. And then 2 weeks ago, I sat down with one of the large language models called Claude, uh, and basically gave it one of the illustrations from my book. I just cut and pasted a JPEG into the large language model and told it, okay, this is the figure. Can you first generate for me a user interface that allows me to interactively select two sets of data points? Remember, I was talking about
Mhm.
dogs versus cats. So I said, okay, I need to be able to select five circles and five triangles, and depending on where my mouse clicks, like that, like 10 seconds, the code is done, right? That piece of code took me 2 weeks when I was learning how to do it. And so and then immediately after that, I said, oh, it can do that. Now I asked it, can you now take this piece of code that you've given me where I select the data points, and once I've finished selecting the data points, can you write a piece of code that implements Rosenblatt's 1959 algorithm so that it can find a line that separates the circles from the triangles? Again, 10 seconds, it's done, right? So basically, I used an LLM based code assistant to show how you could just prompt the LLM to keep generating code, and you can then combine it with the math in the book and the figures and the conceptual explanation with the code this thing is generating to actually learn more about machine learning. Just as an example, it took away about 3 to 4 weeks of work, right?
Mhm.
It was gone. So that's going to happen with software. There's going to be a layer of software engineers who are unfortunately going to lose lose out on the work that they're doing because it's easily replaceable. What's not replaceable is the expertise need. So yes, the LLM generated code, but somebody has to verify it. It was obviously making mistakes, because it's a probably it's
Mhm.
not a it's not guaranteed to be 100% accurate. You also need to know very precisely how to ask it questions. I was able to ask these questions because I had written a book. I knew exactly what I wanted, so I could tailor the prompts. But that those set of prompts reflected very deep human understanding.
Mhm.
So you're not going to be able to replace that, at this point. At least I don't see that happening. So you're going to have a situation where you're going to some of the jobs are going to get replaced, but it will also require another set of people to be maybe even better than they are, to be able to interact with the LLMs or any other AI that comes up in order to make effective use of it, in order to be able to prompt it, to query it, to work with it in intelligent ways where we bring our intelligence into the mix, but then also to make sure that those things are doing what we want them to do, right? So it's both replace, some things will get replaced, but on the other hand, we will need to get better at interacting with them, with the AIs and the machine learning systems. So I think it cuts both ways.
I fully agree that only lawyer who understands and is able to cooperate with the tools will succeed. But it's their younger people's advantage. They live surrounded by these new tools that we had
Hmm.
to learn. Anil, it's been absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on machine learning and your book and your journey with why machines learn. I hope you attracted lawyers to mathematics. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on your podcast. Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, if you haven't already, I highly recommend grabbing a copy of Why Machines Learn. It's a fantastic read. Don't forget to subscribe also to Monday Bagel for more great discussion on AI, law, and technology. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks again, Anil, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
Thank you, Michal. Bye.